webinar series, Mastering OKRs, a three-step success formula with Ben Lamont. I'm your host, Senthil, President and COO, Profit.co. Right. We are excited to have you join us today, and we're thrilled to partner with Ben Lamont, an OKR pioneer and author of a couple of groundbreaking books in OKRs. Right. Over the next few months, we'll be hosting a series of webinars on the ins and outs of OKRs, strategy, execution, and performance management. Before we dive in, I would like to briefly introduce Profit.co, your partner in strategy, execution, and performance excellence. Our comprehensive platform includes strategy execution, right? Defining your strategy as balanced scorecard and executing through OKRs, align teams and focus on outcomes, a portfolio and project management, right? Where you can streamline project planning, execution, and tracking. And once you're comfortable with strategy execution and OKRs, you can include that as one of the factors for employee performance management, right? And build on employee engagement as well, fostering a culture of engagement, recognition, and motivation. And along the way, in the last 5 years, Profit.co has collected quite a few accolades, right? For the last 3 years, continuously based on very strong customer feedback. We have been featured in multiple hype cycles in digital workplace, as well as in HR technology and employee performance management. And for the past 12 quarters, we have been in the leadership quadrant on multiple G2 categories, including OKRs, performance management, and employee engagement. Right. Now, let me do a very quick introduction to our presenter today, Ben Lamont. Right. And Ben Lamont is a pretty well-known name to anyone even remotely familiar with OKRs. And we are very happy that after a 5-year association with Ben, right, Profit.co has had a chance to finally host a webinar with him. Right? We are excited and thrilled. We have been talking about this for the last several years, and it's great that we have now come to this moment. Right? And Ben has coached 2,000 plus business leaders and quite a few very large and enterprises and startups, right, in technology and other verticals. And he has authored a couple of groundbreaking books, as I said before. And the latest one, the OKRs Field Book, is a pretty must read, right? If you are an OKR coach or an OKR captain championing OKR program, either within the company or as a consultant, right, to your customer, right? So with that, let me hand it over to Ben. And again, welcome all of you. A couple of quick announcements. One, please keep your questions coming, right? So we're going to have a Q&A session right at the end of the presentation, but we might break in, for a super relevant question, right? Even in between. So please keep your questions coming throughout. And also for folks who are staying back till the very end, right? There's going to be an opportunity to do an one-on-one consulting with Ben, right? So Ben is going to provide a sign-up sheet, and that's a very valuable opportunity to do that, right? So with that, let me hand it over to Ben. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senthil. Yeah, it has been about 5 years since we've been waiting for this moment, and I will say I'm finally prepared. So I probably didn't need 5 years to get prepared, but like you said, and the OKRs Field Book came out in 2022. That really is going to be, I think, the last book I write on OKRs because it is designed for the coach. So I'm going to cram in an overview of the upcoming webinar series into this little lecture, this mini lecture. And I want to start with a definition of OKRs. First of all, I want you to think of, I know OKR stands for objectives and key results because that's probably why you're on this webinar. So I'm not going to go over the total basics of OKRs, but I want to start with a definition. And I want you to think of OKRs more as a verb. So rather than thinking, oh, OKRs, those are the things, we write down our goals. Okay, so I'm done with my OKRs. I don't want you to be done with your OKRs. OKRs should be a verb. It's like going to work, and it's a critical thinking framework, meaning a set of questions that you ask. So OKRs involves asking a set of questions, and it's an ongoing discipline, which means you don't only ask these questions at the beginning of the quarter or every month or at the end of the cycle or in the beginning of the year or whatever. You're actually asking these questions all the time. And these questions I've learned have really, if you ask these questions, you will just stay on track at work. You will just do better at work. And as OKRs coaches, Ben, it's our job to ask these questions. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I think there is a there are a couple of comments saying that, the audio is a little bit garbled, right? Voice is
Okay.
unclear.
I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix that. Let me see. Let me try using a different speaker.
Sure.
I'm not so sure I'll be able to do this. It's funny because we just did an audio test moments ago. We didn't have this problem. Let's see. Okay, let's set up. Is this better? This is my new voice system.
Yes. From the audience, it's a lot of yes. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, well, guess what, folks? We're taking the headset off. So anyway, well, I'll keep it on. Then at least I can hear things. What I'm saying is OKRs is a set of questions that we want to keep asking. And these questions are things like, why is the objective that you're working on important now? How will we know we've made progress on that objective? What is the intended outcome of the task, right? Because people will make a task list. And we're trying to get people to work together. And we're trying to focus effort to make measurable contributions. Now, not everything we do is going to be measurable. We don't want to measure everything we do. But when we say this is our most important goal, the leadership team needs to define what measurable progress looks like. And then we, as in not just one department, but the company, multi-departments, have to focus effort to make those measurable contributions happen. Okay, so I would go on and on about that definition. That could almost be itself a webinar. But I want to get more nuts and bolts here and talk about how do you actually run an OKRs program? And this is based on my work with over 200 organizations. And to be honest with you, if you read the OKRs field book, you know this. Look, I wasn't always successful. The first 50 or so projects I did, actually, I was just still learning how to do this. And for every step forward, I'd have a step backward, really. Sorry if you're one of my first 50 clients, you really had to go through that. But we had a lot of fun learning together. Now, I really know these three phases work, okay? So the first one is called deployment coaching. Sorry, I lost that. Deployment coaching, and what you want to do, we call it development coaching on this slide. I'm not sure how that happened. But it's actually not a bad way to think of this. This is like building the foundation of your OKRs program, where we answer all the questions that we need to answer before we actually roll out OKRs program. Then we do the training. So we say, here's how we're going to do it. And then we get into the cycle. Phase 3 is really where the action is, right? Everybody wants to get here because this is where you're really doing OKRs. Whereas phase 1 and phase 2, you're just setting it up. My point to you is you have to get phase 1 right. You have to get phase 2 right. And once you do that, of course, then you have to get steps 1, 2, and 3 right. The webinar series that we're going to do is going to focus on each of these 3 steps. In fact, we have 3 webinars coming up as part of the series. This is the first of 4. And each of the webinars will address one of these steps in the cycle. But before we do that, I want to talk about these deployment parameters, right? The questions that must be answered prior to deploying OKRs. At what level will we set OKRs? Are we setting company OKRs, team OKRs, individual level OKRs? If you read any of my material, you know I don't want people to write individual level OKRs for a number of reasons. I do want company OKRs most of the time, and sometimes we want team OKRs, but then the question becomes, what's a team? So we probably won't get into this too much today, but this is really the first place where you need to start. The number of OKRs, how many will we set? Will we only allow one objective per team, or can you have multiple objectives? Anyway, you get an idea. I'm not going to go through all of these today, but I do want to drill in on a couple of these. Okay, the first is, how many OKRs will we have? And what about an internal objective? So in general, with OKRs coaching, a good coach, I'll say I'm a good coach. I want you to be a good coach. You need to have mantras. These sort of statements that you repeat in your mind over and over again, right? Less is more. This is such an important mantra with OKRs. So many of my clients come to me saying, Ben, we need your help. We have too many OKRs. We need to figure out how to narrow down the focus. So if you go back to the 1980s all the way up until about 2015, what I heard was 5 plus or minus 2, which is basically a fancy way of saying between 3 and 7 objectives. And they wanted a maximum of 5 key results per objective. So that means 35 key results would actually be the maximum for a company or for a team, right, for a given level. We started to see a shift down to about 2 to 4 objectives with a maximum of 4 key results per objective as general guidance in the last 5 years of the 2010s. That gives me 16 key results. Now what we're seeing is 1 to 3 objectives with a maximum of 4 key. So we're getting to 12 key results as a theoretical maximum. But what I'm trying to tell you is less is more. I like to see companies have a single-digit number of key results at each level in the organization. So if you're a company, you might have 3 objectives with 3 key results each. That's 9. I'm feeling good about having single-digit number of key results at each level. The meetings will just be better. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to sort of say, I'll emphasize my colleague Christina, who wrote Radical Focus, took it even farther and said, hey, how about only 1 objective? Okay, with like 3 key results. That's really, really focused. I actually will claim that, and I talked to Christina, who wrote Radical Focus, about this, that you can have 2 objectives. So 1 internal, which is about how can we be a better organization, right? So improvements that you're making inside your organization. Maybe your customers don't really care about this, but your employees absolutely do care about this. And then 1 external objective, which is really about making an impact outside the organization. And of course, most OKRs typically look like external. So you might have one internal and 1 external. And when I talked to Christina about that, she said, yes, that's totally fine from a Radical Focus perspective, because we're having just 1 objective internal, 1 external. We don't necessarily want to choose if we're going to have 1 internal or 1 external. And it just doesn't make sense to have only 1 internal objective and no external objectives. Anyway, this is an analysis of how many OKRs. And I want you to do this analysis before you deploy your OKRs program. Similarly, when we talk about how long should the cycle be, right? Now, there's 10 of these deployment parameters. I'm not going to go over all of them, but I want to talk about this because it's so funny, right? I mean, Intel starts with OKRs in the 1980s, and the cycle is 1 month. So it's just, set some goals, a month later, throw them out, start again. That's a very small or very rapid cadence, okay, if you're doing that. If you look at what happens in Measure What Matters, which of course is the book everybody's reading about OKRs, Measure What Matters seems to say OKRs are done quarterly. It was said. It's almost like, and God said OKRs were quarterly, and it was so. And so everybody just said, yep, that's what I'm going to do, quarters. But what you'll also see is that 6-month cycles were pretty common and 12-month cycles were pretty common. But those were all sort of parts of quarters, right? 2 quarters, 4 quarters. Here, though, you look at this little thing here. In 2020, we started noticing 4-month cycles became popular. Well, why is that? Well, this, again, was not the way my clients started out, but a lot of them came back to me and said, Ben, we're doing 4-month cycles. And I said, well, why would you do that? It didn't make sense. And they said, well, if you go from 1 cycle a year to 2, right, every 6 months, there's value for almost all organizations going to 2 cycles, planning cycles for OKRs in a year. Going from 2 to 3, most of the time we see that there's incremental value. The time spent updating your OKRs to get a 3rd cycle is worth it. Actually, we sort of say, not so sure. Going to 4 cycles per year, is that really helpful? It might be. But most of the people we talked to said, well, I just do that because we do quarterly. They hadn't really thought about why. And some of them complained because between December and January or June and July, you have people on vacation. It makes it very difficult to do OKRs planning when everybody's away from the office. And then the quarterly crunch, finance people don't want to talk to you at the beginning of the quarter. Salespeople don't want to talk to you at the end of the quarter. So layering in another quarterly process, all I'm saying is be very careful before you just simply go with a quarterly cycle. Be thoughtful about your deployment parameters. Okay, once you have your deployment parameters laid out, and again, that was a very superficial treatment of deployment parameters. And if you want, you can request more webinars, and we'll go into more of the deployment parameters because I know some of you could benefit from that. But let's just talk about phase 2. So once you know how you're going to do OKRs, it's time to train your organization. And the 2 workshops that I see are usually the leadership workshop, which is designed for your leaders, obviously. And the idea is to get a shared understanding of OKRs and to develop top-level OKRs using the deployment parameters, right, that we defined earlier. So are we doing 4-month cycles? How many OKRs will we have, et cetera, to create the rules for this training. I put here, it could be 2 or 3 hours. Sometimes you do 2 of these remotely, but it's better to do it on site, with your leadership team, and you spend 4 to 8 hours. These people will spend a lot of time. This is an incredibly valuable workshop. I just got back from one that I did in Quebec City in Canada, and it was fabulous. And then the expert training workshops, these are actually designed for people who are going to support the OKRs program. We call these people internal OKRs coaches. And I'm not going to go over the nuts and bolts of this training program, but the goal is not to just simply develop OKRs. It's actually to learn how to ask OKRs questions. This happens to be my very favorite training, and it works really, really well every time. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. So phase 3, which is really the focus for our webinar series. So what I just showed you really was some context, but now I'm going to jump into the meat of what we're going to be doing in this webinar series. Here's where maybe you already have your OKRs program going. So you've already got those deployment parameters. You've already done some training. You're into the OKRs cycle. And what I'll tell you here is that software does come into play in each of these steps, right? Step 1, define OKRs. Step 2 is checking in to monitor progress. Step 3 to reflect and the reset at the end of the cycle. But what we find, and again, this is no offense to Profit. I know I'm on a webinar that's hosted by a software vendor, but for step 1, defining OKRs, you don't really need software for this. This is where you could get a whiteboard and you can talk it through. And defining these OKRs actually is really more of a challenge of getting the people to think the right way and to capture those notes, follow best practices rather than use software. However, on step 2, this is where your OKRs are in a system of record. And here is where I find it's somewhat difficult to do OKRs successfully without some kind of a software tool in order to track your OKRs. And then step 3 is at the end, reflect and reset. Software tool is more of a nice to have here. But what you'll find is you'll spend most of your time actually in step 2, because that's in the middle of the OKR cycle. So with that, let's drill into each of these steps. So the first step, which is to define OKRs, is, look, I told you earlier, the big pitfall that I see is that people define too many OKRs. Okay, I had one client that had 11 objectives. 11 objectives at their company level. And remember, they have, key results, 3 or 4 key results for each of those objectives. So we're looking at something about 40 key results, the 35 to 40 key result range. That's a lot. Okay, we went over that presentation and we were about 2 hours into our workshop and we had just gone over all of their OKRs. And everybody's looking around and saying, Ben, can you help us get this number down? And I looked at it and I coached them up. We were able to get it to 7 objectives. And I'll never forget this. We had like 24 key results total. And I'm still not happy, right? But at the end, we went out, we got drinks. They were so happy because they had reduced their key results down to 24 from like 40. So it was progress. But what I'm saying is I really want you to get a small number of OKRs. The other problem that we see, and I'm sure you've seen this if you've worked with OKRs, is people write their key results to look like a list of tasks that simply measure output, not outcomes. So for example, update the blog, hire somebody, right? These are great tasks, but they're not key results. We have to ask the question, remember, when we're doing OKRs, we're asking these questions. We have to ask the question, what is the intended outcome of the blog, of updating the blog? Well, I don't know. They just told me to update the blog. I'm going to add a blog. I'm going to add some blog posts. That's it. I'm going to add 5 blog posts to the blog. And now I have a number in there. I've got a key result. And I have to say, no. Adding 5 blog posts is simply doing stuff. You can add 5 blog posts. What if they're bad blog posts? Then it doesn't help. What if nobody reads the blog? Is that good? No, you're wasting time. So you cannot write key results that just look like do stuff. You have to think about what is the intended outcome of that blog post. And then they start saying, oh, well, it's to get more blog subscribers. And then pretty soon they say, well, actually, no, getting blog subscribers doesn't help us. What we really want is people to sign up for the demo that don't have a Yahoo email address, that put in their work email or whatever. So pretty soon we start to get into that key result, which is the outcome we want. My point to you is, once you know the outcome you want, you can then make a to-do list that drives you toward that outcome. And then also failing to define why the objective is important. I had one group where they said the objective is to move to the cloud. We're going to move to the cloud, and here are the key results. But then somebody said, wait, why is it so important to move to the cloud? We have some clients on enterprise systems in the United States, and we have this. And do you mean public cloud or hybrid cloud? Or, all of a sudden we're arguing, and we really had a big conversation about why that objective is important. And once we nailed that down, it took us a couple hours, we could tell the story about the key results much better. All right. Again, this is a very high-level summary, but for step 2, checking in, and I'm going to allow time for questions. I can tell you that already. I see that we've got a lot of people on the webinar, so please do start gathering questions on any of these steps. For step two, and this is the one where I said you need software. So for a minute, go back to step one, right? Can you see what I mean? You're defining OKRs. You have to write high quality key results. You don't tell me why the objective is important. These are the big pitfalls. A coach can really help you here, right? Software really can't. Here, what I find, and again, this is me admitting sort of my failure, in those first 50 clients, I did not coach people through step two. I was really good at step one, right? I would do the training workshop, define OKRs. Everybody was excited. I was excited. It was amazing. And then I would say, good luck, because, I'm done. And maybe we'll talk later. Well, when I went back and checked with them, I found about half of my clients did what's called zero OKRs review. We called that set it and forget it. They wrote their OKRs down and they just never looked at them again. They said it was great. It was a great exercise, but they did not check in during the cycle, which made me feel like, I have to structure my program so that I include coaching through the check-in process. But I also found another problem. People started adding OKR specific meetings. I had one client, this is not a joke, okay? They introduced 2 meetings a week just to talk about OKRs. Mondays, they had a meeting where they would talk about their OKRs and what are they going to get done to drive their OKRs and their team. And then Fridays, they tried to celebrate all the wins they had from their OKRs. And they also had all the other work they were doing and all the other team meetings that they had. These were extra meetings. So adding 2 meetings a week to your business is going to be a recipe for disaster for any program. Although they loved it the first 3 or 4 weeks, by the time they get to the 5th or 6th week, people are saying, wait, we're still having 2 meetings a week with my team to talk about OKRs? Wow, not a good idea. The other problem I see is lack of clarity about who's supposed to update those key results, who updates progress. And so the solutions are, number one, integrate your OKRs into your existing team meetings, right? If your company leadership team is meeting every week, you use that same meeting time, you can bring OKRs into that meeting. You don't start with, now we're going to create another meeting every week just to talk about OKRs. The other one I would say is you want to update the confidence on each key result. So what do I mean by that? A lot of times the key result is getting updated in terms of just this is the actual value of the key result. That's fine. But if you're a leader, you don't really care too much about the actual value of the key result. What you really care about is the key result champion having confidence that we'll achieve it or not? Are we on track? Because sometimes the key result is not linear, right? If you look at sales, it could be the second month or the third month of the cycle, and we might have 0 sales. So it's going to look like we haven't made any progress. But if you're the key result champion, you might be saying, hey, wait a minute. We're about to close 4 deals. We're just waiting. Like next week, we'll get at least 3. And so I want to make that green. I'm feeling very confident. I want to make that 80% confident or something like that. Now, if I'm an executive, that's what I care about. How confident are you? Otherwise, we're just having these conversations of why is it at 0? Oh, because the pipeline, those conversations become a headache for an executive sponsor to have at scale. And now the key result champion is a critical person. That's the person who puts their name next to the key result. When I was working at an unknown organization, I've learned not to call out my client names when they did something that was not very good. So I will not name this client, although you know who you are. They had OKRs, but then every key result was just a key result. There was nobody's name next to it. So who's on point for that key result? Who updates the progress? Who do I call if I have a question? Well, I don't know. I guess the department lead, right? Or the team manager, right? Or I don't know who. Maybe I'll just call the CEO because they're in charge of the company. That's not how it works. You need to have a name next to each key result. So a good software solution will actually integrate all of this so that you have, key results as rows, key result champions updating progress along the way, etc. Okay, and then now here's a sample check-in template. And what I mean by this is, in order to check in, and I learned this through my coaching, you have to make sure that every key result champion knows exactly what to do, right? If you just say update progress, it's not going to work. The key result champions are just going to have no idea what that means, or even worse, everyone's going to update progress in a different way, and the meetings will become a disaster. So what we started doing was actually using PowerPoint slides, just like this. And each key result champion would fill this out maybe once a month, something like that. And they would say, okay, here are the 4 boxes. And so they would have to type into this box with font that maybe is a little bit smaller than this, but
you have to be able to read it. So that limits how much information you can put into these boxes. And in the first box, you would say, well, here's the value of the key result. And this is what we did. 2 or 3 things that we did that we're proud of. Here's the predicted score. Are we at 50% confident? That's where we start. Did that confidence move up or down? Is it down to 10%? Is it up to 80%? What's going on? How likely are we to reach that key result by the end of the period? So now, if it's going down, let's say it's at 50%, but it drops to 20%, you're going to have to tell me what's preventing progress. So here's where you talk about blockers. But I also want to emphasize, while I have you here, that sometimes you go from 50% to 80%. Hey, isn't that great? But you have to ask the question, is the key result driving the right behavior? I've seen so many cases where the key result is on track, but there's something wrong, right? Maybe the key result is to get more mobile app downloads. And we're going to get those mobile app downloads. We're going to achieve our target. But these aren't good mobile app downloads. These are a bunch of people that are just downloading it, in some country where they're just getting paid to download, or who knows what's happening, right? They could be gaming the system. Or, oh yeah, we're going to achieve the key result, but our IT department is working, overtime, and this is not sustainable. If we keep doing this, our IT people are just going to leave. Our morale is going to go down. So that's what's going on in this box 3. And then in box 4, we list the upcoming tasks. We found that this type of a template can be very useful, but again, it's in PowerPoint. So imagine developing PowerPoint slides, every month. That's going to be hard to see. And also, you want to see a history of the confidence scores. Can you imagine this, right? 50% confident goes to 70. It goes to 80. Oh, it drops down to 20. I want to see that chart, and I want to say, why did my confidence go down from 70 to 20? Hard to see that in a PowerPoint slide. So, in fact, just for fun, let me see if I could just on the fly pull up a sample tracker. Bear with me here. I sort of promised that I would do this to myself. I want to show you, just to illustrate, what a sample tracker looks like in an off-the-shelf thing like a Google Sheet. So what you'll do is you'll have your objective, right? You'll have your key result. So each row is a key result. You'll put the name of the key result champion here. That's step 1. So up here, it's supposed to say step 1. Okay, there we go. So you finish step 1. See, I could just do that right here in this Google Sheet, no big deal, and it would be just fine. But now you're getting into check-ins, step 2. And now you might do those 3 times, let's say November, December, January in this case. But I might actually have to add 4 columns in here to put confidence scores, completed tasks. See, that I tried to make this look okay, but this template sometimes gets out of control. Now, at the end, we'll do reflect and reset. So I'll show you that. The point I'm making here is every step in the cycle should be in one place. So you want all your OKRs in one system, and you want to be able to see writing them down, step 1, checking in step 2, and then reflect and reset at the end, step 3. So that gives you an idea of what a tool might look like. All right, now back to our regular, go ahead, question.
Yeah, Ben, on the topic of check-in, there's an interesting question from an audience member, Anand.
Yeah.
Right? And he's asking, what is the right frequency for check-ins, right? When your OKRs are for a quarter?
It's a great question. So it used to be that the right frequency was to check in every week. And more people moved away from that, because when you check in every week, there's not much to say for most key results. Now, if you're a customer-facing team, like a sales team, you might be able to get away with integrating OKRs into your weekly discussions. But what we found is bi-weekly has become the new default. Bi-weekly seems to be pretty good. I'm going to be brutally honest with you. I was working with a large bank where things maybe don't move quite as fast as, let's say, a startup company. And that large bank was doing quarterly OKRs. They were doing weekly check-ins. And when I started working with them, they were having problems with OKRs. I mean, nobody really liked OKRs. And they were looking at me like, oh God, here's the OKRs guy. I don't like this guy. And I said, well, what's your problem with OKRs? Well, we meet every week. We talk about it. There's no progress. It's a waste of time. I said, why do you meet every week? They said, well, that's what they told us to do. I said, what if we just meet once in the middle of the cycle for one formal check-in? And they said, well, you mean you can do that? And I said, sure, let's try it. It turns out that was the big improvement they needed. So this question is such an important question. How often do we meet to check in during the cycle is one of your deployment parameters that you have to answer before you roll out OKRs. I would say the minimal viable approach is one mid-cycle check-in, and that's it. If you're not sure what to do, I would start with that, because here's the point, less is more, right? You can always add more check-ins. It's easy to do. And if you only have one and people want more, that's great. That means people like your OKRs program. Well, let's do more of this. Okay. But if at the same time, if you don't have one mid-cycle check-in, well, I'm going to argue you're not really doing OKRs because you have to do each step of the cycle in order to do OKRs. So take that as a possible tip, which is just do that one mid-cycle check-in and that's it.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. And probably one more pretty interesting question, and then I'll wait for some time. Kevin asks, is it possible to have multiple KR champions per KR?
I love this question. The answer is absolutely possible. I'm going to tell you a story. In the book Measure What Matters, it's not possible. In the book Measure What Matters, you only get one key result champion. And that's because that person is accountable for the progress on that key result. And it sort of misses the point because key results are not about you doing your job. It's about us. We're trying to make progress together. In most cases, especially at company level key results, each key result requires multiple teams to drive forward. It's not this team's department's, goal or whatever. So here's my true story. I'm going to do some hands. Imagine that this is the upstairs of the building and this is the downstairs. So we had a company. Everybody on the downstairs, you got your engineers, your IT, all your tech people, right? I would say maybe your smart people. That might be biased. And then upstairs, you have your business people, your hand wavers, your marketing people, your big picture people, right? And of course, they're upstairs, because they're the leadership team or whatever. But very few people could go up and down the stairs and talk to each other. And when the CEO got an update on a key result, it was always one answer from technology and one answer from business. They were never the same. When will we have this release out? Oh, I don't know. We should have it. Marketing thinks by the end of the month. Well, the tech people say, no, it's going to be 3 months out. The CEO is saying, what is it? So what we did was for every key result, we put a name from somebody downstairs in the tech group and a name from somebody upstairs in the business group, forcing those two people to sync up before they updated progress on the key result. And it was a huge win. Okay, so what I would say is it created alignment, it created better conversations. And this is why, as a general rule, I recommend 2 names on every key result. Only have 1 name if there's a really good reason not to have 2, but do not have 3 names on a key result. Okay, because you start to get diffusion of responsibility. It's kind of unclear who's on point. I will say, fine print, I did have one client where they had these things called triads where they had to have 3 names on every key result because they had some kind of a system, right? Where it was like business, technology, and DevOps or something. And so they had to have one from each of their quote triad. I still don't totally understand it, but whatever works for your culture is what you should do. And I don't think you should make a rule that says only have 1.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. Considering the response from the audience, it looks like it was a pretty insightful question and a response. So thank you. Please continue.
Yeah, I will say, I don't know what all the questions are, but the questions that you're picking so far are excellent. So keep them coming. So this is the step 2 check-in. And so what happens then at the end of the cycle? And by the way, we'll have a webinar that goes into each of these steps in detail. So that's the good news. I'm sort of scoping out the overall landscape for this webinar series. But at the end of the cycle, this is what I see. Most organizations skip the step entirely. Now, I like to say I invented this step of the OKR cycle. I mean, look, I probably didn't, but I kind of did because I'm calling it reflect and reset. What most of the organizations were doing is this thing where they look back. They call it a retrospective. I did not invent this. This is like an agile retrospective. I'm not trying to take credit for that. But what happens with the retrospective is they pretty much only look back. So they point fingers and say, well, IT didn't get this done on time and that key result wasn't very well written and blah, blah, blah. So it doesn't really move us forward. So it's more reflect, but no reset. What I've seen happen is that people will actually do a session where they only look back and then they say, okay, great. Now that we've done our retrospective, don't forget next week we have to meet up to draft OKRs. And people are like, oh boy, now we just finished this retrospective. We got to get together again to draft key results. Then we got to get together to refine key results. Too many meetings. So what we found was in order to make this meeting productive, we do it as a reflect and reset. So first of all, we schedule this meeting way ahead of time. We have a clear agenda. I have an email template in the OKRs field book that you can use, right? So that everybody knows how to do this meeting. And the object of the meeting is not only to look back, but it's rather to walk out of the meeting with a draft of the next cycles or quarters, in this case, OKRs. And we're going to hold you accountable for documenting your learning. So here's the point. Look, with OKRs, I think you know this, but I want to emphasize it. It's not just about achieving your key results. The cycle is usually short, maybe 3 months, maybe 4 months, right? It's going to be short. And so you're not supposed to achieve everything and then just keep feeling like, wow, we're making it all happen. In some cases, you'll have a key result like this. Increase the partners from 100 to 500 with a commit of 200 and a target of 300. This happens to be an insurance company. And what's happening is they're an insurance company based in Asia, and they have to get partners to pay $1,000 in order for those partners to be able to sell insurance. And so they had this group that was just trying to get as many partners as they can to sign up to be their partner. And when I talked to them, they said, oh, it's no problem. We'll get to 200 easily. We're already at 100. And I said, really? That's doubling it. You're going to do that easily? They said, oh, yeah, no problem. We have so many partners ready to do this. I was like, wow, that's great. But they got to 140 and then they stopped. And actually, this was about midway through their quarter when they were at 140. And at our mid-cycle check-in, we almost did a reflect and reset actually at the mid-cycle check-in, because I said, wait a minute, you're at 140. What do you predict? Do you think you're going to get toward your commit? How confident are we? And they said, we're going to get a 0 on this. This isn't working. They were already learning in the middle of the quarter. They were already learning that this key result was bad. This happens sometimes, right? So, but at the end of the cycle, we documented our learning. And what we found was that we thought that because the partners paid $1,000, they're paying up front, that these partners would start selling the insurance all by themselves. But what happened was almost nobody did. I think like 4 of the 40 partners even sold 1 certificate, which was their insurance program. They learned that these partners need more handholding. You can't just have them pay the $1,000 and give them the toolkit and say, go for it. And they realized that some of the partners were not good partners anyway. Even if we give them handholding, it wasn't going to happen. So what we needed was to modify. So in the third box, we either keep, modify, or remove. See, in a reflect and reset, there's 3 boxes. First of all, you give me a final score. Secondly, you give me what did we learn? And then third, the key result champion or champions recommend whether we're going to keep the key result, literally copy and paste the key result structure into the next cycle, or we're going to modify the key result, my favorite, right? Where modify means we're going to take what we learned and we're going to create a new key result that's sort of the same, but actually quite a bit different, or we're going to remove it in the end of the day. So in this case, we modify it. What we agreed was we want more high quality partners. We don't want more partners. We want quality partners. And by the way, this happens with OKRs all the time. It's very easy to measure quantities, right? The number of something. I want this many mobile app downloads, or I want this many new customers, or whatever. And that's not necessarily bad, but you got to think about quality also. And so a lot of times at the reflect and reset, this is the type of discussion we have. And when I'll never forget this, I said, what do you mean by a high quality partner? Like, how do we know a partner is high quality? And they said, well, our data group looked at this, and if they can sell 3 certificates in the first month, those are the ones that go on and sell a whole bunch more. And are you measuring that? And they said, yes, we're measuring. We can tell you how many partners sold 3 certificates in the first month. Okay. In the reflect and reset, we didn't figure out what X and Y are, but we said, okay, we know that this is the structure of the key result. So when the reflect and reset ended, we walked out with candidate key results ready to go and even names next to them. And so the end of the meeting, it was, let's get back together next week to refine our key results. And the energy was positive, and we were able to go into the next cycle and bring in our learning. So I'm going to close with the 5 key mantras. I mentioned these mantras earlier, although I didn't touch on all of them. I did talk about less is more, right? Defining a small set of OKRs, or having a small number of teams, in this case, crawl, walk, run, is deploy OKRs piecemeal, right? If you're just about to start with OKRs, please listen to me now, right? Do not try to deploy OKRs across every organization all at once. Maybe start with a company, or maybe start with some pilot teams, or maybe, start with a business unit. I love it when I say this. It says scale it, then nail it. I think this is a Freudian error, because what I'm really trying to say is nail it and then scale it. But so many people do this that I still have this slide here that says scale it, then nail it. And what I mean by this is, if I'm going to work with you, I want to work with you for 2 cycles, and I want to work with small groups to get it set up, and then we can expand the use of OKRs once we see what's working for you. Outcomes, not output. I talked about this a lot, right? Write your key results that look like outcomes, which are results, rather than output amount of work delivered. Do not write key results that look like get 10 blogs posted, right? Or bring on 10 partners. Think about, what are the partners I want? What is the intended outcome of the blog? So drive yourself further toward the value chain of what is the outcome you really want. I didn't talk about this too much, but some organizations try to get all of their work into OKRs, and this is not going to work. And finally, I say here, the only way to learn OKRs is to do OKRs. And what that means is, in the training workshops that you do, try to limit the discussion of the theory of OKRs to about 30 to 45 minutes, and then spend an hour or two or even 3 on the actual development of OKRs and the practice of OKRs. And so finally, look, in this webinar series, we're going to cover 3 steps of the cycle in detail. Now, this is oddly in the exact opposite order, right? So we're actually starting with step 3 in December, reflect and reset, because a lot of you, I hope, will be at the end of a cycle in December, right? And so the reflect and reset webinar will be just in time to get you ready to do a good reflect and reset as you enter into the new year, to take those learnings and build those into your next cycle. Then we sort of assume that a lot of you are on a quarterly cadence, so probably January, February, March. You're going to really want to make sure you know how to do check-ins. And so in February, we'll have a check-in webinar. And then finally, we'll bring it all together and have a best practices for defining OKRs in April, when you're getting close to that. It may not be perfect timing, but it's going to be close. Now, what I want to show you is, because you've made it this far, let's see, I'm going to do a quick check. Ooh, a lot of you stayed on. So thank you for that. You've almost made it. You're almost done with your webinar. But I want to point out that all you have to do is to get your free assessment of your current OKR situation. And by the way, this is really good if you're doing OKRs already. That's who this is designed for. You know, when Senthil said I can do my free OKRs coaching session with you. If you're not already doing OKRs, I mean, I could do that, but it won't be very valuable to either of us because I can't review your OKRs. If you have a sample OKR that you can submit and then mention that you attended this profit webinar, we'll move you up the queue and we'll review your OKR in a fast track. Well, how do you do that? This is me saying it's not that hard. You go to OKRs.com, which is my website, and then you just click take the assessment now, and you say next, right? And then you're going to say, are you currently using OKRs? I hope you'll just say next because you are. And then you'll put some things, you'll see these little check boxes and stuff. And eventually you'll get to loading in your sample OKR. And in that field, you can say profit, and I'll be able to identify that. So that's the game plan for the upcoming next steps if you want to do a review of your OKR situation. And now I'll turn it over to you, Senthil, to facilitate any Q&A. I think we still have, 15 minutes, which is, I mean, this is exactly what we said, 15 minutes for Q&A. We're there, so this is great.
Yeah, that was an awesome session. Been very insightful and a lot of learning. And we have a bunch of questions. We will try our best to cover as much as possible, right? So probably, and there have been questions both in the webinar chat as well as in Q&A. I'm going to cover both. Right? One of the early questions was, how do you differentiate between commit and target, right? They've said commit, target, and stretch goals. How do you distinguish between them? How do you communicate that to your team?
Yeah, let's start with that. So this one here, of course, if you want this, there's a place on my website that gets really into this. Let me just quickly show you that. If you go to OKRs.com, you go to videos, there's this one called pre-scoring, Ben's beliefs on pre-scoring. And this is going to be more information than you want on that topic. But I wanted to show that to you right here, Ben's beliefs on pre-scoring, if you go to OKRs and videos. And then I'll point out that, let me see if I can get back to that. I'll just point out that the commit, this comes together because the commit is really, what do we think we can achieve with our existing resources where we're 90% confident that it can happen? In other words, if this doesn't happen, if we don't hit this level of progress, we are going to be surprised and we're going to have to explain what went wrong. Whereas the target level is supposed to be that 50-50 level. It's like, it's difficult, but it's attainable. It's somewhat in our control, but not totally in our control, right? And that's what the target level is. And then the stretch, what we want to do here is say, what's that most amazing possible outcome? It's like a 10% chance for being achieved. And by definition, the stretch is not totally in our control. we're counting on some other lucky things to happen, or maybe, something happens ahead of schedule or whatever. And that's the stretch. What we found is that the conversation is really important to have around, is it a commit, target, or stretch? Because otherwise somebody says, I think the key result should be this. So I think the key result should be that. But we can align people when we manage expectations by saying, okay, is 10% improvement in revenue, is that a commit or is that a stretch? Oh, no. That's a commit. Oh, it is. Really? So you're almost 100% confident we can get that up by 10%. Okay, I didn't know that. What's the stretch? Oh, 12%. Wait, what? The stretch is only 12%? Oh yeah, because we've got 10% lined up, but to go to that 12%. So sometimes I look at numbers and I say, I'm an engineering guy, right? So I saw this one time where it was like increased partner revenue from 100,000 to like 200,000. The stretch was 2 million. And I said, how can you tell me the stretch is 2 million? Like how's that even possible? Then you don't understand. If we get the Amazon deal, we hit 2 million. And I'm saying we have about a 10% chance of getting the Amazon deal, so the stretch is 2 million. It's very possible. But the target is 200,000. And I'm like, oh, so this is where, again, the commit, target, stretch helps you deal with the very real fact that sometimes things are not linear, right? We have to have a 3-point estimate rather than just here's what I think.
Great. That's excellent. Thanks, Ben. And on the same topic, Allison has a question, right? When you set commit, target, and stretch goals, and when you do mid-cycle check-ins and report your confidence, do you report confidence on hitting each of the levels or just the target level, right? Is it just on the next target or is it on the end of the quarter target?
Perfect point. I mean, I recommend keeping it simple. So going back to this template, all these percentages, let's say you're putting in, I don't know, it starts at 50%, right? And then now you're going to put in 60%. What I recommend you do is put in the percentage only for the target. And what happens is, let's say, for example, in January, you're saying, oh, I'm at 10%. Once you start to get a really low percentage, the next question becomes, are we confident we can hit the commit now? Or in this case here, usually you're going to bury the commit and the stretch in here. So you write the key result as a target, you bury the commit and stretch. But this is useful to then have as a back pocket item. What gets tricky, I've seen some people do it, but I don't want you to do this, which is like, let me make a matrix of percentages. Like, well, what percentage am I confident I can hit the commit? What percentage am I confident I can hit the target? It's probably not useful. You want to pick one. I will say that in some organizations, they'll do the commit. They'll start at 90%, and they'll start to say, well, what's my commit percentage? And maybe this goes to, maybe it's even 100% because it's been achieved or whatever. The point I'm making is, I can just say this in general. I was working with a government organization, and they really wanted to be able to say that they're going to achieve everything. So they wanted to say, well, these are our commitments, and I want them to all be 90% to start. Okay, that's actually not a bad idea if you want to feel like you're winning. Like, are we hitting our commitments? But it's not a stretch culture. Other times I've seen startups where they say, well, no, we're going to just do the stretch. 10%, 15%, or whatever. Then it usually becomes 0% because they realize it won't happen. But the idea here is now they're talking each week about the stretch. My point to you is pick one and probably pick the target, unless you have a really good reason to pick the commit or stretch.
Sure, that was super informative. Thank you, Ben. Now, Scott has a question on chat, right? His question is, how do you incorporate traditional project portfolio management? And he says transitional, but I think it's he meant traditional project portfolio management with OKRs. And a good deal of the larger projects take more than 3 or even 6 months to see the results.
Yeah, this is a really challenging question. I like to look at each organization separately, but I'll answer it by starting with the extreme simple way to think about it, right? Which is here, you would put a key result and then you make action plans here. So it'd be, launch, 10 new clients with such and such or whatever. And then you're going to have action items. So you're going to, onboard, you're getting into details, onboard deck updated or whatever, send new client email templates, assign, I'm making it up, assign account owners, etc. Okay. So this is where you'll usually see a key result, and then you'll see a bunch of action items, and you'll put somebody's name here, Bob, whatever. This is not done or whatever. Okay. So you can see a little bit of that here. This is not answering the question, but this is giving you an idea of, yes, I do want you to keep your action items separate from your key results. In some cases, the reason why this is a tough question is that in some cases you'll see a project itself look like an objective. Succeed with this project as measured by, here are the key results. Okay. I've seen that. Now, you can't do that for every project, because if you're not careful, if you have 1,000 projects, you're going to have 1,000 objectives. So that's generally not the right way to go, but I've seen that work if you have a small number of projects. In other cases, you have your OKRs, you develop those, and then you start to look at your projects and you try to map them to which key result are they driving toward the most. So I'll leave it at that, because there's probably 3 or 4 other answers of how we could do this. But I will say it's got to be figured out. And this is one of those deployment parameters, right? That's unique to your organization, that my suggestion to you is try to figure out the answer to this question before you deploy OKRs. Otherwise, you're going to get this question, and if you can't answer it, it's not going to look good. I'll just put it that way.
Thanks, Ben, for a very practical and actionable response. Now, Jeff has asked a couple of questions, and they're all around the champions and accountability of champions, right? So he said, why are having, why is the concept of having owners and champions, is it catching steam now, right? I mean, that's his question, and I think he's expanded it by saying, has the term champions and accountability, right? Has it evolved recently, and is it trending now, right? And what was done before that neglected this practice? Yeah.
Well, I will say that in the beginning, it was key result owners. And I use that term as well, key result owner. And the problem was, right, if you're a key result owner, just think about it. It makes it sound like it's your job to get that key result done. And unfortunately, let's go back to the definition of OKRs. What we found was that key result owner just doesn't really work so well, because remember, OKRs is trying to ensure employees work together. And if you start saying you're the key result owner, I've seen it actually impact the culture where that person is just worried about getting that key result done, and they don't care about the other person's key result. You're the key result owner for that. What do I care about that? I care about mine. I'm the owner for this. So the word owner can become a problem. And also, in many cases, by definition, the key result requires multiple people across teams in order to be achieved. So you have to have a key result champion. That's the word I use now. Or we see key result manager, key result ambassador, right? Something else besides key result lead, right? But not key result owner. Because in many cases, the key result champion, even if the key result is not achieved, what their role is to alert leadership. So for example, if the key result is not achieved and you alert leadership on the last day of the cycle, that's bad. You did not do a good job as key result champion. If you're a key result champion and you alert leadership, like at the mid-cycle check-in, this is not on track, here's what's going on, that's actually good. You're actually a good key result champion. Even if the key result isn't making progress, it's not only about progress, right? It's also about communication, and it's also about learning, making recommendations to keep, modify, remove, right? So if you say key result owner, people tend to think, uh-oh, I guess that means I have to put in numbers that make the key result look good because I'm the owner and they're going to tell me if I'm doing my job or not. That's why I like key result champion. So I think most organizations have moved toward that. And also by putting 2 names on the key result, it also gets this idea of ensuring employees work together, which is literally part of the definition of OKRs. And I want to emphasize, some organizations fail with OKRs because they create more silo effects. They actually reduce the alignment by using OKRs in a way that's not helpful. I had one client that was trying to use OKRs in order to improve alignment. And then when they hired me to go in, I noticed that the way that they were going to set this up was actually going to make alignment worse. So finally I had to say, wait, time out. And we had to merge teams, like sales and marketing became a team. Engineering and product became a team, right? So instead of having teams literally built on the org chart, we merged teams together that work closely together and then created a set of OKRs just for those groups of teams. Anyway, that's probably more than you wanted, but I think it's a very important question about the terminology that we use and what are the unintended consequences of using those words.
Sure. I think that was pretty illuminating, and thank you very much, Ben. Now, Ashok has a question, and we have quite a lot of questions. We may not be able to cover everything now, but Ashok has a pretty interesting question. Do you advise linking committed OKRs to performance of individuals?
Okay. So generally, because we're doing OKRs at a team level, right, as opposed to an individual person level, we don't recommend linking key results formally to your performance management for individuals. That would be the best answer I can give you. I think if you start getting into I'm doing individual person level OKRs, okay, that's a whole different conversation, but I don't think we have time to go there.
Yeah, I think we'll and we have a bunch of questions on check-ins. Folks, we are going to have a whole webinar on the topic of OKR execution and check-ins. But probably one quick question, Ben, is that who should run the check-ins? Who should be holding the teams accountable for executing tasks to move the needle on KRs?
Okay, so there's two types of check-ins. There's what I call the team check-in, which is like the bi-weekly check-in, which should be done by the team leader. The team leader generally facilitates that. However, there's also the mid-cycle check-in, which as a best practice involves multiple teams. And in this case, I want it to be the internal OKRs coach, or what I call the project lead, the OKRs project lead. If you read the field book, you'll see that. That person should be the facilitator. It's often an agile coach. Maybe it's an HR business partner. Maybe it's a chief of staff or an executive assistant, somebody like that. But it's not the team lead. And it's not because there might even be multiple teams involved. So this person should be somewhat neutral, more of a facilitator when they're working across teams. In some cases, you'll actually have an outside person coming in to facilitate the check-in within a given team, but that's very unusual because of resources, and typically the team can handle that internally.
Great, that's pretty helpful. Now, we'll probably have time for a couple of questions, right? Let me pick up two more questions, right, if we can cover. One, how do you ensure leadership buy-in and support for OKRs? I know it's a big topic. We discussed this before, but somebody has asked this.
It's a great question. I think number one, we were joking, Senthil, before the webinar. I mean, just get them the book, Measure What Matters. Most executives read Measure What Matters, and they get so excited about OKRs that you actually have the opposite problem. Now you have the problem of trying to rein in their excitement. Hey, it's not going to be that great. So consider Measure What Matters, but then again, be careful because you might get your executive sponsor too excited. The other technique, though, that seems to work really well, and I would offer to do this with some of you if you do the free assessment, is just do an OKRs coaching session with that executive sponsor. Start asking them, what is the most important objective? Why is it important? How will we measure success? What is the intended outcome of that task, right? Start doing the OKRs coaching process with that person. I know it's hard to get the meeting. I had one story where I was going to do this with somebody, and it took me almost a year to get this meeting. I mean, he said, oh, yeah, I want to meet with you to talk about OKRs. And he was this relatively famous author on business intelligence. And finally, he took the call for 30 minutes. And I said, that's all I need. And we were on the phone for about 2 hours because I was asking these questions, and he was finding it so helpful that by the end of it, he was saying, oh, I forgot how valuable it is to take a step back and have somebody ask you these questions. So really, my best recommendation for the executive sponsor is just ask for 30 minutes of their time and just say, okay, I know you might not be on board with OKRs. Can I just take 30 minutes with you to show you a little bit what it's like? But don't present any material on OKRs. Just start going into OKRs as a coach, and you'll see that executive will then at the end of that meeting, it might go 2 hours, but they'll say, wow, this is incredibly valuable if you're a good OKRs coach. So that's why I'm saying if you want to get executive sponsorship, just let me know in your assessment when you fill it out, and we'll set up a meeting where you'll say, hey, I know you're not interested in OKRs, but I've got this guy, Ben Lamorte, and he's willing to do it, a session with you because you're an executive and all that. And then I'll do OKRs coaching with your executive. And I would say 90% confident, right? I'm ready to commit from an OKR perspective to being able to get that executive to come out of there saying, hey, I'm excited about OKRs.
So probably one last question. I know, and Ika Pillai, your questions will be answered in the subsequent sessions. All right, that's a question on LinkedIn, right? We have a problem with weekly check-in. Can we do monthly check-in?
Yes. Weekly check-ins are probably a little bit too fast for most organizations. Monthly check-ins are good. Here's the problem, though. See, if you do monthly check-ins and you miss one, because that's going to happen. You're going to end up missing one. I don't know, somebody's sick or, there's a vacation or whatever. Now it's 2 months between check-ins. So that's why I sort of like bi-weekly check-ins. And then if you miss one, don't worry about it because then it becomes monthly. But absolutely, you could do monthly check-ins. Fine print, if you have a quarterly cycle, what you're really going to do is just one mid-cycle check-in. Because you'll look at it, you'll say, I set OKR step 1 in the beginning of the quarter. I check in the middle. and then I reflect and reset at the end. So I guess you could say reflect and reset is also a little bit like a check-in, but inevitably when you look at it, it just doesn't make sense to have even 2 check-ins in a quarterly cycle. If you do a 4-month cycle, now you can have 2, sometimes even 3 check-ins in the middle of the cycle.
Sure. Ben, thank you very much for your insightful session and very illuminating answers. And thank you very much, audience, for
yeah,
very
really good questions.
questions.
I'm hoping that a lot of you will be coming back. I know it's not until December, but let's and hopefully we can talk before then, right? If you fill out that assessment, we can have a chat beforehand. It won't just be me talking, with Senthil about OKRs high level. But I love your questions. And a pleasure. Thank you, Senthil. I know it's been 5 years, so I'm really glad that this first webinar is under our belt.